friends, and welcome to the second episode of the Expressive Watercolor series. In today's class, I'm going to be breaking down the steps of how to complete different value scales while working with both the Sharpie and your V5 pens. We're going to be starting out by filling in the darker areas with Sharpie and then going back through and adding layers with the V5 to add that finer detail. You'll be completing different types of value, and our goal is to increase the space between our marks to make something look lighter and bring our marks closer together to make them look darker. So we're going to be practicing doing these techniques with both our value scales and our sphere. Once you've mastered the value on the top portion of our page, we're going to move down and complete a copy of the example that you can see, and it's very similar to what you're going to be working on for your final project. I'm going to show you how we start out by using Sharpie to fill in the solid black sections, and how we use our V5 to go back through and work on adding the fine details and to add all of the fading areas of value where it starts to get lighter. So let's go ahead and get started. Each student should be working with their own Sharpie and V5 pen, and we'll begin this practice by working with our Sharpie. The first step to the hatching value scale is to go through with your Sharpie and make sure that you're not going outside of the lines as much as possible, but we're just filling this section in with vertical lines and trying to make them very close together. As we continue on, we want to have our lines slowly start to space out. And notice that I'm starting to not even fill the boxes completely with my lines. They're starting to get shorter and farther apart. I was working with my Sharpie for the first 5 boxes, but now I'm going back through and using my V5 to fill in the detail lines between those Sharpie lines. And this just gives us a nice line variety. So I'm going through and using my V5 lines, and once I reach that 5th box, I'm slowly starting to really space out those marks so that you can see that transition is nice and smooth to a lighter value. As I get farther down, my lines are getting shorter and farther apart, and those are the main differences between our darker values and our lighter values. Next, we're going to begin working on our cross-hatching value scale, and we're going to fill in our first box with lines that are very close together. Notice that the main difference between hatching and cross-hatching is that we're adding a second layer, which is very important to remember because adding 2 layers makes it much darker than if we were just adding 1. So as you can see, when I go back over the top of my second value with that next layer, it does really increase the darkness. So I have to plan my spacing accordingly. I'm going to continue making my lines farther and farther apart as I make those diagonal lines, going across and adding those multiple layers. And when I get to my 5th box, I'm just barely adding just short little lines with my Sharpie. Then I'm going to switch to working with my V5 so I can fill in the finer sections and details in between those sections that I added with my Sharpie. I'm essentially just working on filling in the gaps and also working on helping my value transition from box to box. So I'm trying to make it appear like it's still getting lighter, and my V5 can be helpful for that because it's a much thinner line, so it doesn't look quite as dark. Notice that for my last values, I'm really spacing these lines out very far apart from each other, and a lot of the lines are quite short. They aren't filling in the entire space. The next type of scale we're practicing is our scribbling. So we're going to begin by working with our Sharpie, and we're going to fill in that first box with very tight, small circles so that we don't have much white left showing in the middle of each circle. As we continue down, we're going to increase the size of our circle so that more of the middle is showing through, which means that it looks a little bit lighter. We're going to continue working with our Sharpie all the way out through our 5th box and maybe a couple of little details in our next one just to make sure that we have interesting line variety. Next, we're going to come through with our V5 pen and work on filling in any of those gaps that's necessary to make it a nice smooth transition with our values. Remember that each box should look different from the one next to it, and we want it to progressively get lighter and lighter. So I'm going through and adding in my V5 in the lighter boxes for my scribble values, and I want to make sure that the circles that I'm using and the marks are spaced farther and farther apart as we get towards the lighter end of our scale. The final type of pen value that we're going to practice is stippling, which actually involves a lot of the scribbling techniques at the beginning. So we're going to fill in our first box by using the same scribble technique that we used for the value above it. We're going to do this for a couple of boxes, and we can use very small scribbles to mimic the pattern that you get when you create a lot of dots. And this is saving us a lot of time because rather than going through and adding every single little dot to fill in the darker values, we're just mimicking it by adding a lot of scribble marks. We will need to transition into the stipple dots, which we're just tapping very gently with our Sharpie so that we aren't damaging the end or the point of our Sharpie. We don't want to be tapping very vigorously because then your dots have little tails. They look like Nike swooshes or something. So make sure that you're taking your time with this step, and you should just be very gently raising and lowering your pen. Then we're going to come through with our V5 pen and add in the dots that can go in between all of those spaces, and we're looking for those white sections that need to be filled in to help our values have a smooth transition from the dark to the medium to the light. As we reach these lightest values, we're just very carefully spacing our dots so that they have an even amount of space between all of them to help the values look more consistent throughout the boxes. Our next step is to practice the values that we just completed on our scales to the left, and we're using them to create the values that you'd see on the sphere. Now we're beginning in the exact same way by using our Sharpie to fill in our darkest values. And I would like for you to fill this in using a combination of the scribble and stipple techniques. We're going to begin by using the scribble, and we're filling in the darker values that you see along the right side of the sphere. And remember that as we're working, we need to make a crescent moon shape with our darker values. It should not be just perfectly even all the way through. So a crescent moon means that it's going to come to a point on the outside edges of that sphere, and in the middle of the moon, it's going to be thicker. You'll notice that I added in a combination of scribble and stipple with my Sharpie before I switch over to working with my V5. So now I'm going to kind of go back through and add a little layer using a scribble technique, a very tightly wound scribble, so that there's not much white showing, to help increase the darkness of that value in an easier way. So I'm going to go back through and add a little layer of that scribble, just going through that section of Sharpie. After I completed that layer of scribble with my V5, I transitioned to using the stipple technique and adding very small dots that were all quite close together. And my goal here was to create a nice medium tone. And I'd say that one of the biggest mistakes that students make with pen value is that they will try to fill in a nice solid section of dark, and then they'll just skip to the white, and they don't have a very nice smooth transition that leads them all the way out to that white highlight. So taking your time during this step and really making sure that you have a smooth transition from your dark to your medium, which you're adding in the V5 stippling effect, and then all the way out to fading to the white. And notice that there is not a very large highlight for this sphere, so you should have most of your sphere filled in with medium tone. The final step to filling in your sphere is to add that super fine light layer of dots that lead up to the little circular highlight that you'll see at the top left corner of your sphere. Next, we're going to fill in the shadow that's directly underneath our sphere, and the darkest area is where the sphere is touching the tabletop. So we're going to use our Sharpie to fill in a pretty solid area of black before we transition to our scribble technique, and then again to our stipple technique. We're going to use our V5 to help us fill in some of those bigger gaps that were left by making the scribbles with our Sharpie, and then we're going to slowly transition out to the stipple. This shadow should have a nice smooth transition from dark to medium. We don't have to fade out to the light, and it should have an even amount of texture with your scribble and your dots, so no large gaps. The next portion of this skill building activity is helping you to practice filling in a face that contains sections of value that are black and then areas where it transitions out to white. And we're practicing on a portrait because that's what you will be doing for your final project. So we're going to begin in the same way that we did for our value practices, and we're going to start out by using our Sharpie to fill in any solid sections of black. And we want to be careful not to fill in any areas where there's going to be a transition. So any areas where it fades to a medium tone, or any areas where there are little highlights showing through. So only sections that we know are solid black. We also want to make sure that we aren't going into any spaces that need to have a nice crisp point to them, because our Sharpie end, the point of our pen is actually fairly dull compared to the size that we're working at right now. So we want to save all of the fine lines and points to do with our V5. At this point, I had filled in most of the solid black areas, although I realized that the beard was one of the largest black areas, but it did have some little highlights to it. So to complete this section, I worked still with my Sharpie, but using a scribble technique and making sure that I was leaving plenty of little highlights to show through. I remembered that I can always cover up if I have too many highlights left over, but I can't go back through and add highlights if I filled in too much. So it's always better to fill in lighter than you think you're going to need to, because it's much easier to cover things up than it is to start over. At this point, I had done pretty much all I could with my Sharpie, filling in my solid black sections and avoiding any areas that faded. And for your final project, this is where you would pause and go through with your watercolor to fill in all of your details before you added your V5, because your V5 is not permanent like the Sharpie, so it would smear with the water from your watercolor. Since we aren't adding watercolor to our practice, I just went straight to the V5 and started working on creating some of the finer details, like working on adding the eye and making sure that I include all of those tiny little spots that I see, like that small reflection in his eye, the little top to his eyelid, making sure that I'm practicing filling in that value as best as I can. In areas like this section of his nose, I'm essentially creating a small value scale like we practiced on our value scales above. So I'm really working to make sure that my stipple dots are smoothly transitioning in the same shape as what I see on my reference photo, but smoothly transitioning out to the white on his cheek. To work on areas like his mouth, I made sure that I outlined all of the sections that I knew for sure needed to stay white before I started working on adding in any of my solid black value. And I did this just to make sure that I didn't forget where those little highlights needed to stay. I also went through with the stipple technique and used that to just kind of fill in some of that space so that it wasn't too light around his mouth. While working on the top part of his nose, I made sure to leave that skinny little highlight that's off to the side before I continued working on adding in the shape. To be able to fill in the solid areas of his mustache and the side of his beard, I decided to first provide myself with a rough outline, and I tried really hard to pay attention to the details that were printed onto my paper, similarly to how your details will be transferred onto your paper from your final choice that you do for your project. So I went through and added that detail to make sure that I would have an edge to go all the way up to before adding in the value. There are a lot of highlights created by the texture of this beard. So in this bottom section especially, I made sure to use some very open circles for my scribbling so that I would be able to choose the highlights that I wanted to keep in that area. To create the value scale that was up against the shadow along his neck, I first worked in a scribble technique, and then I used the stipple technique to help fade that value out into white. To create the border on the top of his beard, I used the same techniques that I did for the bottom, where I went through and just provided a loose, rough outline of where the values started changing, and then I worked with both stipple and scribble to help fill in that space and help it transition out. From here, I found all of the tiny little details that I needed to go through and fill in with pen over the top of where they had been printed. This included areas like the back of his neck, where I created a small value scale, up against the sleeve of his shirt along the top of his back, the edge of his tank top, the value scale along the top of his shoulder, the rough edge along the darker shadow on the side of his shoulder, the fading value along the edge of his forehead, and finally, all of the fine lines, the points, the value, the details, all associated with the flowers on top of his head. And this is what the final result looked like. Your goal with this practice is to try to get your second photo to look just like your reference photo, at least to the best of your ability. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope that you learned a lot about using your marks being closer together to make darker values and your marks being farther apart to make lighter values, in addition to knowing when to use your Sharpie versus your V5 pen. In our next episode, we're going to be working on a watercolor practice, which is in preparation for your final project, which will combine both of these techniques. And I'm really excited to see what you make for your final. So let's go ahead and get started on the next episode. Thanks for watching.